Good evening, and welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Rachel Kinderdine, Community Manager. Tonight, we join Dan Schnur for the March Dan Schnur Political Report. Dan's topic tonight is When the Dust Settles, What Super Tuesday Meant in California and across the country. For those of you who would like to submit questions for Dan, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. Katie Gilman and I will be managing your questions during the Q&A segment, which should start in about 30 minutes. For anyone who hasn't joined us over the past few months, we're trying out a new format. In the second half of the program, we'll welcome member Bob Stern to ask an audience question on screen. So we're really excited to have Bob with us. And if this is something you're interested in doing yourself, please reach out to Katie and we will send you more information. We also wanted to remind everyone after the webinar members only session will begin tonight after the State of the Union address. So if you're planning to join that, we will be starting after the webinar when the president finishes his speech. So not after the Republican response, after the president finishes his speech. So Dan, we're looking forward to tonight's program and I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Okay. Good. Well, hello, Rachel. Hello, everybody. Thank you, as always, for joining us for tonight's discussion. As always, I'm really grateful for your participation and your interest. As Rachel mentioned, tonight is the night of the President's State of the Union address, always one of the more important milestones on the political calendar every year, but a particularly important speech for Joe Biden, who, although he's facing the same opponent as he did in last year in the 2020 presidential campaign, unlike in 2020, at least according to some public opinion polls taken recently, it looks like Biden has become somewhat of an underdog and is going to have some ground to make up over the course of the next 8 months. And so certainly between now and November, we're going to hear no shortage of speeches and interviews and advertisements from Biden and Trump both. In a lot of ways, tonight's speech is almost a kickoff of the presidential campaign. In the Super Tuesday primaries, which took place earlier this week, Trump eliminated his last remaining Republican opponent. And so we really do have a general election just getting underway. And for Biden, who, as I said a moment ago, does have some ground to make up, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the first 30 minutes of tonight's program. This is Biden's first chance before a very large audience for him to lay out his vision of what he thinks not only should be the next year in our country, but his vision for the path that we ought to be on for the next 4 years. So like I said, while every State of the Union address is important, this is particularly critical for Biden to begin framing the stakes of his reelection campaign over the next several months as we go forward. Now, next several months, that phrase, I realize in this context, may have a little bit of an ominous tone to it. Because both parties' nominations were settled so early, this is going to be the longest general election campaign we've experienced in modern American political history, featuring not only the two oldest, but the two least popular presidential candidates we've seen in modern times. But still, even given those challenges, there's still a lot of lessons to be learned from what's taken place to date. And even though Super Tuesday this week, where 15 states and the territory of American Samoa all voted in their primaries and caucuses, even though Super Tuesday wasn't that super this year because both parties' nominations had been settled, the voter patterns we saw, even while Trump and Biden were amassing very sizable victories, those voter patterns are giving us some early clues on what we need to be looking for as the election proceeds in terms of the challenges and the opportunities available to both candidates going forward. Now, what we saw from Trump, or what we saw on the Republican side, is a pretty clear delineation of the voters he's going to need to win back should he, in order for him to regain the White House. His base, conservative Republicans, are even more solid in their support for Trump than they were in 2016 and 2020. For those of you with somewhat long memories, you may remember, for example, that back in 2016, Trump was the subject of some suspicions, some discomfort among many conservatives, particularly social and religious conservatives, because his personal biography did not necessarily line up with their issues, and because they didn't have a lot of familiarity with him in the political context because he'd never run for office before. That's not the case here in 2024. The Republican base, the conservative base, is as solid for Trump as it can be. His challenge is going to be reaching out beyond that base. Because while he won in 2016 by reaching out to some of the swing voters, because Hillary Clinton was so disliked by so many Americans, Trump's going to have to figure out a way to expand that base in a different way this year. And the voters he's going to need to win over in order to achieve a victory in this election were demonstrated to us very, very clearly on Tuesday night. Simply put, a Nikki Haley voter, almost by definition, is a swing voter who Trump needs in order to achieve victory in November. The voters, the demographic voter groups, and the geographic areas where Haley did best among college graduates, among higher income and suburban voters, among particularly professional female voters, those are the voters that Trump needs to win back. And according to public opinion polls, while many of them will remain in the Republican fold in November, a lot of others aren't so sure. So what we saw on Tuesday night on the Republican side was a very clear map and set of objectives of who the voters are where Trump is not as strong as he needs to be. Now, for Biden, the challenge is a little bit different. For Biden, the challenge is a lot different. Because while Trump's goal is to reach out further to the political center, Biden's is just the opposite. Biden is actually doing fairly well, not great, but fairly well with swing voters in this country. Biden's problem, as I know many of you know, is with the Democratic base, with young people, with voters from minority communities, and with other progressives. Voters who, by and large, were never all that enthusiastic about Biden, even back in 2020. In all likelihood, they may have been supporters of Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, and ultimately decided to vote for Biden because they believed he was the candidate most equipped to defeat Donald Trump, an assessment that obviously ended up being correct. But those voters are profoundly unmotivated, and Biden needs to find a way between now and November to remotivate them, if not on behalf of his candidacy, against Trump's. That dissatisfaction has manifested itself on a number of issues over the last 4 years. As many progressives don't think that Biden has been sufficiently aggressive on issues like climate change, on voting reform, on student loans, on police reform. And all of these frustrations have crystallized in growing frustration, if not downright anger, from the Democratic base toward Biden, given the way he has navigated the war in Gaza over the last 5 months. And just as Nikki Haley's vote provided us a very clear picture of the votes that Donald Trump needs to win this fall, what we saw on the Democratic side in a number of states, first in the state of Michigan last week, and this week in the state of Minnesota and a few other states, an unusually large number of votes for a quote unquote uncommitted option. Democrats who turned out to vote in their party's primary, but went out of their way not to cast a vote for Biden. Now, many of the president's most senior advisors believe that those voters will come back into the fold in November once they no longer have the luxury of simply registering a protest, but are forced to make a choice between Trump and Biden. Others aren't so sure and believe that Biden, in any number of ways, is going to have to find a way to reconvince those loyal Democrats who wouldn't vote for Donald Trump if he put a gun to their head and a knife to their throat, but to convince those loyal Democrats that he's worthy of their attention and support in November. So two very different goals from two very different candidates. We're also going to talk tonight, both a little bit in the first half an hour and hopefully more in the second half hour, about the fight for Congress. And right now it appears, and of course, with a very, very narrow Republican House majority and an even more narrow Democratic Senate majority, it looks like both parties are in danger of losing control of their respective chambers. And according to prognosticators, while it's still too early to make an absolute prediction, the most likely outcome in Washington next January is that instead of a Republican House and a Democratic Senate, more likely than not, we see a Republican Senate and a Democratic House. And we can dig in a little bit deeper as we go forward into the election results and what that means for the fall, not only here in California, but elsewhere around the country. Anyway, lots and lots to talk about. Super Tuesday, the fight for control of Congress, and of course, what the State of the Union will mean, both tonight and going forward. So with that, Rachel, if you're still around, maybe you can come rejoin me and we can take this conversation a little bit deeper. What do you say?
Definitely. Thanks, Dan. So, as you just mentioned, the Senate race in November will go to a runoff between Adam Schiff and Steve Garvey, which, when this campaign started, seemed like an unlikely outcome. It seemed like it'd be a close race between the three Democratic candidates, including Katie Porter and Barbara Lee. So, what happened in that race?
Boy, that's a really good question. And a lot of people have been asking that question, not only over the last couple of days, but over the last several weeks. Most notably, supporters of Porter and Lee, most notably, Democratic progressives, who from the beginning correctly saw Schiff as the most centrist of the three candidates. It did appear there was going to be a fairly intense battle between the two wings of the Democratic Party, with Schiff representing a more centrist establishment wing of the party, and Lee and Porter in different ways, making the fight on behalf of progressives. My own feeling as to what happened is from the beginning, the three candidates all presented themselves as progressives, but in different ways. Barbara Lee, not just in this campaign, but throughout her career, has been a social justice and a racial justice progressive. She's not only the only House vote against the Iraq War way back in 1991, but since then, she has defined her progressivism primarily in racial and social terms. Katie Porter, like her mentor Elizabeth Warren, is more of an economic progressive, and she spends a great deal of time, or has spent a great deal of time, as Warren has as well, talking about corporate influence in politics and reining in the excesses of big business. Also a strong voice from the left, but with a different type of issue emphasis. And Schiff, who, like I said earlier, has been perceived and in fact has been more centrist than the other two for most of his career, he defines his progressivism primarily in his opposition to Donald Trump, particularly managing the Trump impeachment during his time in the House of Representatives. So essentially, the choice between California Democrats was, what kind of progressive do we want? An economic progressive, a social justice progressive, or an anti-Trump progressive? And what became clear over the course of the campaign is the latter of those three, the anti-Trump progressive, was the most viscerally motivating for many California Democrats. Now, to be fair, Schiff did have a pretty sizable advantage in another way, because very early in the race, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi not only endorsed Adam Schiff, but went out of her way to help raise great deals of money for his campaign and gain a lot of other endorsements for Schiff from other California Democrats. And so, given that anti-Trump message and given the tremendous fundraising advantage, it became clear that Schiff was going to prevail. But then something interesting happened, or more accurately, something interesting didn't happen. So you have one centrist man, you have two progressive women, in a state that has been represented by at least one woman in the Senate since Dianne Feinstein's election and Barbara Boxer's election back in 1992. And looking back, I find it a little bit puzzling that there wasn't more of an effort among progressive Democrats to convince either Porter or Lee to leave the race and consolidate that support behind one or the other. Now, to be fair, if you added up Porter and Lee's vote totals on Tuesday night, they still fell well short of Schiff and of Steve Garvey. But I have to believe if just one of them rather than both had been in the race through the fall and the winter, you may very well have seen a different dynamic where there would have been more of a two-way discussion about which direction the Democratic Party should go on. And I wonder if there are some California progressives today wondering if maybe they shouldn't have made more of an effort to talk one or the other into stepping back in order to consolidate their support behind the other. We can talk more later if you like, and if our audience likes, about the Schiff strategy of attacking / promoting Steve Garvey to boost his support among conservative Republicans. But I think even before that happened, the real story here was among Democrats, and California Democrats deciding that their animus for Trump outweighed other strains of progressivism. Number two, the support of Pelosi and what that entailed. And number three, the decision of both Porter and Lee to stay in the race, even at each other's detriment, are probably the three best answers I have to your question.
Well, thanks, Dan. And I think we have a question for the audience next.
Oh, that's right. We have a poll question here. And before we put it up, well, can we hold off on that for 1 second? Oh, it's up. It doesn't matter. All right. So I talked a little bit about Steve Garvey, and we can come back and talk more a little bit later, should our audience like, about the advisability and, of course, the success of Schiff's strategy to promote Garvey. But we now have a general election between a Democrat and a Republican in a state that's overwhelmingly Democrat. I think Adam Schiff is about as likely to lose to Steve Garvey as the Harlem Globetrotters are to lose to the Washington Generals. It's hard to see a state where there are just enough Republicans in California to get a candidate in the runoff, and this is evidence of that. But only 25% of registered voters in the state are Republican, and that's not nearly enough to win a general election. So I simply can't see a plausible outcome in which Garvey is competitive, let alone winning. That said, question for all of you. There's been a lot of talk, particularly among Democrats, about whether the fact that there's a Republican on the ballot, even one who's more than likely to lose, does that help Republicans in other ways? In other words, if Republicans know that Trump isn't going to win California and there were no Republican on the ballot for Senate, would they bother turning out to vote for congressional races? And that debate has gotten pretty pitched and will get even more pitched in the months ahead. So our question for you is, will having a Republican on the ballot, will Garvey's presence as the Senate in the Senate race on the ballot help Republicans running for competitive House seats here in California? And remember how closely contested the overall margins are in the House. And as we'll talk about later, the House races in California could end up determining which party controls the majority in Washington next year. So question for all of you, does having Garvey on the ballot, will that increase Republican turnout on behalf of their candidates? Or second, will it not make a difference? Trump's not going to win California anyway. Republicans may or may not be motivated. It doesn't really make a difference. So what do you think? Will Garvey help Republican turnout by virtue of being on the ballot, even in a likely losing race, or is it not going to make a difference? What do we think? Oh, interesting. Closer race, the closer outcome than we're used to seeing from you. 43%, a plurality, but not a large one. Don't think it'll make much of a difference. But 34%, slightly more than a third of our group, thinks that actually will help Republican turnout. We're already hearing progressive Democrats in California calling on Schiff to use his very sizable campaign war chest to fund Democratic House races here in order to keep that from happening. And we'll see if that occurs as things go forward.
So shifting the conversation a little bit, Trump obviously had a night full of big wins on Super Tuesday. So my next question is, what have we learned about Trump's support in the general election based on the primaries?
Okay. So I talked about this a little bit in the introduction, but I appreciate, Rachel, the chance to go a little bit deeper. So it's worth thinking back, number one, it's worth thinking back all the way to November and December of 2022, right after the midterm elections, when Republicans didn't do nearly as well nationally as most prognosticators and most pundits had predicted. And at that point, Trump was bearing a huge amount of blame from a lot of Republicans, feeling that his outsized presence in the race had harmed many Republican candidates in competitive races. So that at that point, that's when Florida Governor Ron DeSantis began to look like a very a powerful challenger to Trump. And we saw a field of roughly a dozen or so other Republican candidates get into the race, including the former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. But if you were to look back at news coverage of those early months, and my guess is if you were to look back at our previous webinars, you would have not seen a lot of people paying a great deal of attention to Haley's candidacy, because between DeSantis and Mike Pence and Tim Scott and plenty of others, there wasn't a lot of attention to go around. But give Haley credit, even though she withdrew from the race after losing fairly convincingly, not just on Super Tuesday, but in the weeks preceding Tuesday's vote. Give Haley credit because she did achieve a very important goal. Nikki Haley this year became the nominee of the non-Trump Republican Party. And even while that doesn't do anything to affect the primary outcome, it does give her a voice in the party's future, because at some point in the not too distant future, Republicans will begin to wrestle with the direction they take in a post-Trump era. Do they continue with his brand of republicanism, much more isolationist, much larger government than traditionally Republicans have embraced? Or do they return to a Reagan era of conservatism, the type that we've heard from Haley over the course of the campaign? And Haley has ensured herself a very important voice in that discussion. Well, it's interesting, though, and I did talk about this a little bit earlier, but think about it in the context I just described, and that is the battle for the post-Trump Republican Party. The voters who sided with Haley, even though greatly outnumbered by Trump supporters, have some very, very distinct demographic characteristics. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, they're disproportionately college graduates, unlike Trump supporters. They tended to be of greater economic means than Trump supporters. We tended to see a lot of suburban voters leaning toward Haley instead of the small town and rural conservatives who opted for Trump. So in other words, as I said earlier, what we essentially saw are the swing voters who will determine this election, opting to vote not for Trump, not for Nikki Haley. And it was very, very notable that on election night, when Trump was fairly caustically insulting Haley, Biden put out a statement making it clear how interested he was in talking to Haley's supporters. Now, to be fair, some of Haley's supporters on Super Tuesday and prior were voting in the Republican primary, even though they weren't Republicans. Some were independents, some were more moderate Democrats, and many, of course, were Republicans. But in a general election, these are the voters who are going to determine the outcome. And as I said earlier, Haley gave us a pretty good picture and some very precise insight into who the voters are that will determine both the outcome of the 2024 election, but probably the direction of her party going forward.
And I think you've hinted at this as well, but why did Haley stay in the race for so long, even after it was clear that she wasn't going to beat Trump?
Well, you're right, Rachel. We did talk about this a little bit, but once again, it's worth going into it in a little bit more detail. There's no way to guess, it'd be silly to try, is whether Nikki Haley will be the Republican nominee for president in 2028. Some people think that as her criticism of Trump became more intense, after it became a one-on-one race when the other candidates dropped out, many Republicans feel that there'll be such bitter feelings toward her among Trump's loyal supporters that she won't have a chance in 2028. On the other hand, Republicans, at least until the last few years, historically, have generally been much more likely to reach to the second place finisher in the next election, even if the disagreements in that previous election were very intense. Think about it. Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. ran against each other in the Republican primary and exchanged some fairly harsh words over that campaign. But ultimately, Bush became Reagan's vice president, and ultimately he went on to succeed him as president. George Bush's second place finisher was Bob Dole. They said some very critical things about each other, but 4 years after George Bush left the White House, Bob Dole was the Republican Party nominee. After Bob Dole, second place finisher to George W. Bush was John McCain. Second place finisher to John McCain was Mitt Romney. Both went on to be their party's nominee. So this bitterness doesn't always last over the course of several years. Again, but the point here is not whether Haley will be the nominee in 2028 or not, but more broadly, whether Republicans will continue in the down the ideological course that Trump has set for it over the last 8 years. Will they return to more of a 20th century, more global, more interventionist, a more international approach, a brand of Reagan conservatism once again, or will they will they head out in a new direction, either some combination of those two or something entirely different altogether? And I think Haley understood that while the likelihood of her being the nominee was fairly slim, that establishing herself as an important voice for the party's future was worth staying. And think about it. If she had dropped out late last year and had stayed in until roughly the time that Pence or Scott or DeSantis got out, well, then she probably wouldn't have that kind of visibility and influence. But by sticking it out longer and establishing her voice to a greater degree, she's inserted a future for herself. And I have to believe, just as an aside, that even though it's less likely, and I know we'll be talking about this in a little bit with our friend Bob Stern, if something were to happen to Trump between now and the convention, either a health-related issue or one of the legal challenges that he's facing, and the party needed to turn to a new nominee, Haley, by virtue of finishing second in the primary, would be, if not, perhaps not the most likely pick, but certainly a very plausible one. I mentioned briefly the legal challenges that Trump is facing. And as I know all of you know, there are no fewer than 4 criminal cases being heard against him. And the biggest question at this point is not necessarily how those cases will be resolved, but when they'll be resolved. And one of the things that has been so frustrating to Trump's opponents is that many of these trials, for a whole range of reasons, are not moving forward on the timeline that was originally envisioned. We can talk more about this in the second half an hour too. But before we do, I just want to get a sense of what our group thinks about Trump's legal challenges, what they see going forward as it relates to these trials. We know that a certain number of Republicans say that they will not vote for Trump if he's convicted in one of these trials. It's not a huge number, but in closely competitive states, it could be a determinative number. And as these trials look more likely to be delayed, therefore, of course, the likelihood of a conviction becomes less also. And we don't know yet how these calendars are going to play out, but let's ask our group's opinion. What do you think? Do you think Trump's trials will have taken place by the election? And we're going to force you into an unfair set of predictions. Do you think, number one, that one or more of these trials will have been held and completed? Number two, do we think that one or more of them will be underway, but none of the trials will have reached a verdict? Or do we think actually that none of the 4 trials will be underway by Election Day? Let's see what our group thinks. Oh, once again, pretty close to a split decision here. 49%, a little bit less than half, say that none of the trials will be completed. I know, many legal observers believe that the New York trial, probably the least impactful of the 4, but is most likely to be completed by the end of the year. But almost half of our group says no. 42%, a little bit less than that, say, well, at least one of them is going to be done by then. and 9% think that none of the trials will have even begun at all. Very, very interesting. Don't you think, Katie?
Yeah, very interesting. And so, if we do have time, I want to speak a little bit about Biden and his base. So, Dan, my first question for you on this is, well, last week in Michigan, over 100,000 Democrats voted for uncommitted rather than for Biden, and several states followed suit on Tuesday night, with nearly 20% of Minnesota's Democratic voters choosing uncommitted. So, how much of a problem is that?
Okay. Well, we don't know. As I said earlier, many of Biden's senior advisors have said that these more progressive Democrats who are upset with Biden for climate change, for voting reform, for student loans, but most of all for Gaza, that they've made their point, they've registered their displeasure, but when it comes time to vote in November, they know that refusing to vote, sitting home, would essentially greatly enhance Trump's prospects of winning the election. And many of Biden's advisors, many senior Democrats just simply don't believe that's going to happen. But a growing number of progressive leaders, a growing number of leaders from the base of the Democratic Party are warning the White House that might not be the case. They say these progressives, they don't like Donald Trump at all, but they're so disappointed in Biden, they might not turn out. And as we'll talk about a little bit more going forward, Biden and his team are working very feverishly to find a way to convince those progressives that he is worthy of their support in November, even if he's not as motivating to them as a Sanders, as a Warren, as an Ocasio-Cortez. So it's a warning sign. Let's agree to that. But whether that warning turns into an actual problem, it's going to be months before we have the answer to that question.
And following up on that, what other voter groups does Biden face the biggest challenge with for this general election? And do you expect him to try to address those voters in tonight's speech?
But Biden really does have a two-front battle ahead of him. I mentioned earlier that he's doing better with swing voters in the center of the political spectrum. And that's true, he's doing better with them, but still not well enough. And there are certain issues like crime, issues like inflation, and most of all, the immigration and border issues that are really hurting Biden with those voters in the center. But as I said earlier, I think Biden's biggest challenge is not reaching out to undecided voters, but remotivating the Democratic base. And again, we talked about this earlier, young people, Black and Latino voters, single women, and other progressives are voters who Biden has to win back. And I think your question is right on target, because this is something that he's going to have to begin in earnest tonight. And in the speech, we're going to hear a lot. We're going to hear him talking about taxes, about raising taxes on the wealthy in order to provide more government support in underrepresented communities and to reduce the deficit. That's a very populist, a very Sanders and Warren-ish message designed very specifically to motivate Democratic progressives. We're going to hear him talk about Gaza. And as was reported widely over the course of the day today, Biden is going to announce tonight a new Gaza relief effort in order to get food and medicine, other types of sort to the people in the Gaza Strip. And make no mistake about it, while Biden is certainly not backing down on his support for Israel, by highlighting support for Gazans in his State of the Union address, this is his very clear effort to reassure Democratic progressives who think he hasn't been doing enough for Gaza, that he wants to do more. And then probably his greatest challenge tonight and in the general election is on the issue of immigration. And if I had to guess, we'll see him try to walk that same uncomfortable line tonight that he's been walking for the last several months and will be walking for the rest of this year. On one hand, Biden understands that the American people are very concerned about the border, and they do think that there are too many migrants coming into this country without documentation. And so Biden, in recent months, first in Congress and then in speeches, and now possibly by executive order, has been talking about more restrictionist measures to rein in undocumented immigration. And as we've talked about in previous webinars, this is unprecedented for a Democratic president in the modern era. Normally, when the parties talk about immigration, Republicans talk about how to restrict undocumented immigration. Democrats talk about a pathway to citizenship. There is no talk in mainstream political circles now about making it easier for individuals to migrate to this country. Biden, too, is talking quite a bit about enhancing security at the border. We'll hear that tonight, too, but we'll hear it, he'll try at least, to present that in a more humane way than he feels Republicans have presented this message. Once again, he needs to reach out to those swing voters to show that he's willing to be strong on border-related issues. But he can't go too far in that direction because he needs the Democratic base to stay with him, and so he can't afford to alienate them by sounding too strong. So I've offered my thoughts on what I think Biden's and Trump's biggest challenges are in the election. But what do you say we ask our group? So let's go with Biden first. Who do you think Biden's biggest challenge will be this year? Do you think, as I've suggested, that it will be with progressive Democrats who aren't going to vote for Trump but might stay home? Or do you think ultimately that the way elections are won is in the center, and that Biden's biggest challenge on issues like crime and immigration and inflation is to reach out to those swing voters? Or is it both? Does he have to find a way to do both at the same time, no matter how difficult that is? And let's see what our responses are on this one. Wow, 63%, almost 2/3 say both. Well, so we haven't made life very easy for Joe Biden either tonight or going forward. And among the rest, I note that there's a slight turn toward reaching out to swing voters as opposed to motivating progressive Democrats. So it's not the first time our group has disagreed with me, but I'll take some solace in the fact that it's not that vehement a disagreement. So I think I can handle it. Now let's see what they say about Trump. So let's put up our final question. Same question, although obviously in reverse for Trump's biggest challenge this year. Does Trump have to work particularly hard to motivate conservatives, the base of his party? Or as many of you said with Biden, does Trump have to figure out a way to reach out to swing voters in the middle of the political spectrum? Or like Biden, will you decide that he needs to do both, that both are critically important? Well, let's see what this group shows, or what the group shows on this one. Okay. Boy, this one's not even close. Looks like I did make the sale on this question, don't you think? Only 3% think his biggest challenge is motivating conservative voters, and I think they're just trying to make me mad. 80% say that his biggest challenge is going to be reaching out to undecided voters, and as you heard me say earlier, I think that's exactly right. But as Rachel mentioned earlier, and this has very quickly become one of my favorite parts of our program, and I know yours also, Katie, is I love this new feature where members of the organization, not just guests, but members, get to join us for questions. And I understand that my old friend Bob Stern is joining us tonight. Is that right?
He is. I'm very excited to introduce Bob to the discussion right now. Bob is the former president of the Center for Governmental Studies, principal co-author of the Political Reform Act of 1974, and he has been watching Dan since the beginning in March of 2020, and I know they are friends as well. So Bob, welcome.
Well, thank you very
Bob,
much.
you and I've been watching. Bob, you and I've been watching each other since a lot longer before 2020.
Well, that's for sure. But I always learn something from you, Dan. So thank you for doing these programs.
Well, I'm glad you like them, and I'm really glad you're with us tonight, Bob. I know you've been thinking about unlikely but plausible and important questions about unexpected turns that might happen in this unexpected twist that might happen in this campaign.
So, Dan, 8 weeks ago, I told my current events class that there was a 25% chance that either President Biden or former President Trump would not be the nominee of their parties for the November election. Yesterday, I raised the odds to 49% that one of them would not be the nominee. So here are my questions, Dan. If Donald Trump should have a stroke and come to the conclusion he can't serve as the nominee for the Republicans, who will Trump endorse And then secondly, who will the Republicans pick at their convention? The Trump endorsed candidate or someone else? And if someone else, Dan, who's that going to be? And then if Joe Biden should have a stroke and comes to the conclusion he can't serve as the nominee for the Democratic Party, who will he endorse? I think we know, probably Kamala Harris. But then who will the Democrats pick at their convention? The Biden endorsed candidate or someone else? And if someone else, Dan, who's that going to be?
So I'll take the Biden question first, just because neither of them are easy. Boy, those are rough ones, Bob. And I might not agree with your 49% assessment, but there is certainly a legitimate chance that one or both of them might not end up as their party's nominees. Trump for legal or health-related reasons, Biden for health-related reasons, or I think even more likely than his health, depending on how his son, Hunter Biden's legal challenges proceed. I could see that putting an extraordinary amount of pressure on a loving father who, of course, lost his other son just a few years back. So I'll start with Biden. If I had to guess, and of course it's a total guess, is I think Biden would, in fact, whether it was because of a health reason or for any other reason, I think Biden would not tell the convention who to select. He's certainly not going to replace Kamala Harris on the ticket. We know that the political ramifications of him dropping the first African-American female vice president in the nation's history would have create huge challenges, not only with Black women, but with his base more broadly. So if he's the candidate, she's going to be the running mate. But we also know that a lot of people around Biden have very significant, excuse me again, have very significant concerns about Harris's capabilities as a candidate. And I think, that rather than endorsing her and guaranteeing her the nomination, I could see Biden saying, this is for the Democratic Party to decide, just like you would in a primary system. So I think he would step back and not endorse his successor. For Trump, I think it's become clear how much the new Republican Party not only relies on Trump, but identifies with him and has remade themselves in his image. And so I don't think many of the convention delegates have any idea of what they could or should do should Trump not be able to lead them forward. I don't know who Trump would recommend as his replacement. I don't think he thinks that way. But I would say this is, as much as Trump controls the Republican Party, I'm not entirely convinced that if he did recommend a replacement, I don't know that the party would accept that replacement, because the party is so divided. And while Trump did dominate the primaries, a lot of that is not because of an ideological advantage on his part with Republican primary voters, but rather because a lot of Republicans see him as their incumbent. And they supported him as much for institutional or ideological reasons. So I don't think Biden would pick a successor. I don't know who Trump would pick, but even if he did, I don't know the convention would necessarily go in that direction. Fascinating question. I think it's a little bit less likely to happen than you do, Bob, but I will be more than happy to eat crow if it turns out that you predicted something that I dismissed way back in March of 2024. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.
And Rachel, I know we went a little bit long. There was a lot going on with Super Tuesday and the State of the Union address, but we've still got time for some questions at least. So why don't we try to get in as many as we can?
Perfect. So our first audience question is, how likely is a contingent election in the House on January 6th, 2025, due to a combination of third-party candidates, election confusion, and multiple court cases?
Okay. I would say this, the biggest challenge here is a third party or independent candidate. While Trump's court cases, so his legal challenges could have an immense effect on the election, I see them less likely to lead to an undecided electoral college. But if the no labels movement does put a plausible candidate, a unity ticket as they've been promising, on the ballot, if Robert F. Kennedy's support does maintain at these levels, if candidates like Jill Stein and Cornel West do achieve even small amounts of votes in key swing states, then it's much easier to see a situation where no candidate gets to 270 electoral votes. So I don't dismiss the other alternatives entirely, but one of the challenges of a multi-party race is how much it increases the chances of the House of Representatives deciding a campaign. And what I would say is, in that circumstance, and this is one of the reasons that so many Democrats are so angry at the no labels movement, is that remember that if the election goes to the House of Representatives, every House member does not get a vote. If that were the case, then whichever party won Congress in November would determine the election. But rather, the way this is determined in that very rare circumstance is every House member doesn't get a vote, but every state's House delegation gets a vote. So all of California members of Congress decide together who to vote for, and they get one vote. Wyoming's House member gets to decide. Alaska's House member gets to decide. And even while the balance of power in the House is fairly evenly split, and may be again after the election, because of the way the political map works, Republicans have the majorities in many more House delegations around the country than Democrats do. So if neither candidate gets to 270 electoral votes, that's a decided advantage for the Republican nominee. And at least at this point, whatever you think of the idea of no labels putting a unity ticket on the ballot, and there are many people who find that to be a very attractive option, they haven't yet provided a satisfactory explanation of what would happen in that situation, other than presumably allowing the House to make Donald Trump president rather than the Electoral College.
So can Kamala Harris bring the progressive wing in, and what effect would a more visible VP candidate have for either nominee?
I don't know that the VP nominee is going to make a lot of difference for Trump. 8 years ago, he needed Mike Pence. Religious conservatives, evangelical and fundamentalist voters, a lot of establishment Republicans weren't really comfortable with Trump. They didn't really trust him. And Pence became his emissary to those groups. At least for the conservative base of the party, Trump doesn't need that help anymore. So I think rather than making his choice out of political calculations, he's much more likely to make it on a personal basis. It's the kind of person who he simply would enjoy campaigning with for the remaining few months of the campaign. Biden and Harris is a trickier question because, as we all know, according to public opinion polls, Harris didn't get off to a great start as vice president. And voters were very down on her for the first couple of years. She had some early stumbles, particularly as related to issues relating to immigration and the border and on voting reform also. But as the election draws closer, the Biden campaign, the Biden brain trust, I think justifiably, is seeing more and more value in Harris. She can, while she's not necessarily seen as a movement progressive, the way Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren might be, she's certainly a more credible messenger to those voters than Biden himself. And an issue in particular, which, as we've talked about in this webinar before, works immensely to the Democrats' advantage, the issue of abortion and reproductive rights. Harris is a much more credible and forceful messenger on that issue than Biden is. Biden himself does not support abortion, but has made it clear for many, many years that even though he personally doesn't support abortion, he does very strongly support keeping it legal, though he's very pro-choice. But it's not an issue as a devout Catholic he's particularly comfortable talking about. And Harris talks about abortion rights, both in a way that can motivate Democratic progressives and can persuade swing voters. Harris talks about the issue in a much more emphatic way. And that alone is dramatically increasing her value to the ticket. But in other ways as well, we've seen her not substantively, but rhetorically edge closer to the Palestinian cause than Biden has, not sounding quite as ardent in her support of Israel as the president. That's a message to progressive voters. And on any number of other issues, though, without substantively differentiating herself from the president, she is making more of an effort to talk to those voters in an election in which Biden has to motivate the base. Harris does become a more valuable asset to the ticket than she may have been earlier in the Biden presidency.
So your mention of Israel and Gaza is actually a great segue to our next question, which is, will today's announcement that the US will build a pier to bring aid into Gaza by sea help or hurt Biden with key constituencies in the fall, especially those in swing states?
I don't know that it's going to make much of a difference. Totally aside for what any of us think about the war in Gaza and the best way to resolve it, I know that all of us, myself included, have very strong feelings about it. There's no question that the domestic political impact here in the United States creates a horrible political dilemma for Biden. As we've said many times tonight and previously, he needs to motivate progressives. And Gaza, more than climate change, more than voting reform, more than any of the other issues on which they've been disappointed in Biden, this is an issue that infuriates them. Meanwhile, the center of the Democratic Party, the more traditional establishment wing of the party, is still very, very strong in their support of Israel. If you look at poll numbers, that branch, the pro-Israel branch of the Democratic Party, is decidedly larger than the more progressive voters who lean more toward the Palestinians. But Biden has to find a way to satisfy both. And while I understand what he's trying to do today to at least send somewhat of a message to Democratic progressives, I don't know in the long run that today's announcement to provide additional aid is going to make much of a difference to voters on either side of that divide. Let's agree, regardless of how we think the war ought to be resolved, that providing food and medicine, other types of necessary support to the people of Gaza is an important and necessary thing to do. So on substance, his goals are very clear, but he has clear political goals as well. And I don't know that today's announcement is going to help him reach those goals.
And moving on to a couple of Trump-specific questions that we got, the first one being, will any conviction preclude Trump from serving another term as president? Excuse me.
So legally and constitutionally, not just 4 convictions, but the 90+ charges that he's facing, he could be found guilty of all of them. And that would still not prevent him from being sworn in as president if he were elected. Because as I know many of you know, the Constitution has 3 requirements only for a president of the United States. And none of them have to do with whether the individual has committed or been convicted of a crime or not. So legally and constitutionally, it makes no difference at all. Politically, it might make some difference. We've seen that many of Haley's supporters in the early primary states have indicated they would not vote for Trump if he were convicted of one or more of these crimes. I think the Trump campaign is confident, with some reason, that many of these voters will change their mind if that actually happened. If you want to think back far enough about it, in the late 1990s, there were a lot of people who said that they would no longer support Bill Clinton if it turned out that if he were impeached. And of course he was, and many of those voters still stuck with him. So not as many of the Republicans who have told pollsters that they won't stay with Trump if he's convicted, a lot of those will go back to him, but a good number won't. And in those key swing states, in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, in Georgia and Arizona and Nevada, it doesn't take a lot of votes to swing those states. And so even if a small number of Trump supporters decided after a conviction that they would not vote for him anymore, that could be determinative in a way that the legal and constitutional questions would not.
So, in the same vein, if Trump wins in the fall, how likely would a GOP trifecta be?
If Trump wins in the fall, how likely is a GOP trifecta winning the House and the Senate and the presidency?
Right.
I think the odds are still against it. We've seen before that Trump really doesn't have very long coattails. People vote for Donald Trump, or against him for that matter, because they have very strong feelings about him. And that hasn't translated into down ticket support in the way that it often does for other presidents, popular or unpopular. As I said earlier in the program, the most likely outcome, given how close both the House and Senate margins are right now, and given the way the political landscape looks, I think the most probable outcome is that Republicans regain control of the Senate under a new majority leader, which we won't have time to talk about tonight, unfortunately, but that Democrats will reclaim control of the House. Is that guaranteed? Of course not. But it is worth noting that if the Democrats are going to regain control of the House and prevent that trifecta from happening, should Trump be elected, Democrats are going to have to win back the House in the states of New York and California. There are 18 congressional districts in the country that voted for Biden, but also voted for Republicans for House. Almost half of them are in one of those two states. And if the Democrats can reclaim some of those seats, not even all of them, then they regain the majority. I know not everyone in our audience is from California, but for those of you who are, you will have a front row seat this fall for the outcome of the majority of the House of Representatives, because in all likelihood, it is going to be decided in the state as well as in New York.
And one last question tonight. So for our final question, what is the political reason that the Supreme Court agreed to adjudicate the immunity issue?
Okay. I don't know if there was a political reason for the decision, but let's assume that the court decided to take on the issue of whether a president or former president should be immune from these types of legal charges, because they believe that the issue is too important to American democracy to be decided by a lower court. Now, smart people on both sides of the issue, on both sides of the political divide, can argue about the timing and what this means in terms of the court cases. But if I were a mind reader, which I'm not, I recognize that John Roberts, in particular, the Chief Justice, takes the role of the Supreme Court, being seen as at least somewhat of a neutral arbiter in our system. He takes that very, very seriously. And so I believe that even if this case is not proceeding as quickly as many would like, that the Roberts courts decided to take it so they would not be seen as rushing to judgment in one direction or the other. There are those who believe that they're intentionally trying to help Trump win the election. I don't think that's the case. This court had the opportunity in 2020 on any number of occasions to rule in Trump's favor in a way that would have dramatically increased the chances of him staying in office, and they didn't do it. So I really do think this is Roberts and at least 4 other justices deciding that we want to be seen as addressing this case with the seriousness that it deserves, as opposed to trying to put their thumb on the scale one way or another. I'm about as hesitant to predict the outcome of Supreme Court cases as I am to predict the outcome of presidential elections. That said, I believe that particularly because the court ruled not to remove Trump from the ballot in Colorado and Maine and other states where the issue had been under debate, I believe that it's very likely that the court will decide not to grant Trump immunity. The question is when they make that decision. Many think it'll wait until it'll take long enough that a verdict will not be reached until after the election. But as some of you may have seen just yesterday, the court announced that they would hear this case a little bit sooner than many people had anticipated. They're going to hear this case in late April. And that means it's entirely possible that they could have a decision by late May, which would allow the case to proceed and to be resolved by November. For those who want to see it resolved by November, obviously having it start in March is better than having it start a couple months later. But I wouldn't be quite so quick to assume that it's not going to happen until after the election. But obviously, there's really no way to know for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for your excellent analysis as always. And I just want to say thank you again to Bob for joining us with your insightful question. I really look forward to seeing all of our members shortly or any members shortly for our members only after the webinar session, which will begin after the State of the Union address. Once again, so after the president finishes his speech, not after the Republican response. And for our members and audience, we hope to see you at one of our upcoming programs. So next Wednesday, March 13th, join us online for a webinar with Maxwell Stearns. He's the author of Parliamentary America, A New Vision for Democracy. And on Monday, March 18th, we host Dr. Anthony Ames, author of A Voice in Their Own Destiny, Reagan, Thatcher, and Public Diplomacy in the Nuclear 1980s. In April, we're also hosting the 27th Administrator of the Small Business Administration, Isabel Guzman, for an in-person event, and more details on that are coming soon. So be sure to visit our website for more events coming over the next few weeks. And thank you so much again, Dan, and I hope you all have a great night.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks, everybody. And I look forward to seeing many of you after we watch the State of the Union address. Have a good night, everyone.